Good evening, everyone, and welcome to St George's Battery Point. My name's Victor. I'm one of the ministers here, and it's a great pleasure to welcome you to our third Henry Baldwin Lecture. Before we get underway, I'm just going to let you know a couple of housekeeping things. The first is if you've got a mobile phone, I'm going to invite you to take it out and turn it on silent, but don't turn it off. Because we're going to be taking questions via a program called Slido, which you can use your mobile phone for, and I'll tell you about that in a little bit. If you need them at any time, the toilets are through the doors just over this way, and so you can make use of those as well. In case of a fire, I have to do this announcement. We're not going to have fire, but in case of a fire, our chief fire warden is Simon, and we've got Arthur as well, and they'll put on a white vest and take over from me up the front, and our ushers will pop on some fluoro vests, and then they'll help direct you out the doors that you came in to the green, which will be our emergency assembly point. That's about it on that. Before we get underway, I'm just going to take a step back here. Thanks, Nick. I just want to say just a huge thank you to Alex and Susanna for providing some wonderful atmospheric music for us as we came in. We've got a couple of bunches of flowers for you ladies. So, so where's Susanna? She's disappeared. Oh, there she is. Okay, Alex, Susanna, thank you. Why don't we give them a round of applause? Well, tonight is the second Henry Baldwin Lecture. Henry Baldwin was a lifelong parishioner here at St George's. He served as a church warden under 7 rectors. Can you believe it? That is a long time. And on his death, Henry made a generous bequest to St George's, as well as to quite a number of other churches and institutions in Hobart. And so this lecture is named in honour of his contribution. We're convinced that Christian theology has the intellectual and spiritual resources to help us navigate the challenges of contemporary life. The Henry Baldwin Lecture aims to provide a thoughtful contribution to our public discourse, and so we are delighted that you could join us here for this year's third Henry Baldwin Lecture. Our topic this evening is there no balm in Gilead? Truth-telling, lament, and healing, a conversation. We're taking a slightly different approach from our previous 2 lectures. In those, we only had 1 speaker, but tonight we'll be in the mode of conversation with our speakers Greg Lehman and Tim McCormack, and I'll be moderating that conversation. At about 8:30, we're going to open up the conversation for questions, and you can use a program called Slido. So if you get out your mobile phones and go to slido.com, and then you can type in that number that's there, 2507251, and you can basically type in your question, and you can also vote on which questions you would like answered, and the ones with more votes go up to the top. So that'll be open, that's open now, and that'll be open for the rest of the lecture, but I'll remind you again when we get to question time, so you don't, if you haven't managed to do it now, that's okay. I also should say welcome to those who are joining us on live stream. We're delighted that you could join us as well, and we're trying to be a little bit democratic with the question time, so it's just going to be on Slido, and so that means those who are online can participate in the same way as those who are here in person, and hopefully it'll also help mediate between the extroverts and the introverts in the room. Always the extroverts like me who like to talk, but the introverts, you can type your questions and we will hopefully answer them. Before I invite Greg and Tim up, we're going to hear from artist Michael Henderson about his sculpture, Remember, that you can see at the right of the church. You may have had a little bit of a look at that as you've come in. Michael Henderson is an activist artist whose work is less recognisable for style and more for the stories behind the work. He aims to create works that give value to all people, that give expression to sorrow and longing for a more beautiful world, and one that opens ways to explore life with genuine wonder. This work is entitled Remember. It was the first of a 3-part sculpture series called How Lonely Lies This Land, and I'm going to hand over to Michael just to share a little bit more about the work, and then I'll introduce our 2 speakers for this evening. Thank you, Michael. Okay, Michael has been very, very helpful in reminding me I've missed something incredibly vital, which was before introducing. I need to, introducing Michael, I need to invite Maria to come up for an acknowledgement of country. Maria is a member of St. George's, and she traces her ancestry to the Western Tier region. So I'm going to hand over to you. Thank you, Maria.
Good evening, everyone. I'm part Aboriginal from the Big River tribe from the Western Tiers area of Tasmania. My great-great-great-grandfather, John Cornelius, an Irish freed convict, married an Aboriginal woman, Mary Ann McCoy, who became my great-great-grandmother. I did not know of my Aboriginal heritage until 20-ish years ago. To find these ancestors was a great joy, and it answered so many questions about mine and my sister's upbringing. My parents never spoke of our Aboriginal heritage, which came from my mother's side of the family. Discovery meant an answer to why we never fitted in. I realise now that Mum's Aboriginality was known but not spoken of in the community. But without words, we were kind of at arm's length in the community where I grew up. Actions speak louder than words, and my mum was a classic example of this. She had a natural affinity to the land and all creatures that dwell in it, and she has passed this on to her children and grandchildren, along with her faith in this land creator God. The country, opportunity for everyone to show respect to the traditional owners, the continuing connection of Aboriginals and Torres Strait Islander peoples to country. We acknowledge the Muhanina people and pay our respects to their past elders, and we pay our respects to the elders of today's Tasmanian Aboriginal community, past, present, and those to come, who are guiding their people as they work for true reconciliation of all people who dwell in these islands, and as they work for all the pain of the past to be recognised and healed, so that we can all live peacefully and respectfully in this great Southland of the Holy Spirit.
Thank you. Well, sorry. Thank you. one of the pieces of the artwork that Victor introduced is at the back there on Remember. I'm just going to pick up on something that Maria just said to do with actions. Victor introduced me as an activist artist, and what I think about in terms of that meaning is that I spend a lot of time listening to people. What I mean by that is that that conversation that's happening over time then informs what I'm going to create as an artwork. Does that make sense? It's not so much that I love ships. I don't mind them. I do happen to make a few of them. It's not so much that I love large scale or any of those sort of things. The way this work has come about was that in 2017, a bunch of people from across the country, Indigenous people from all over the place, got together and made one clear statement. I thought that was pretty profound. And then it was ignored. And then after a year, I thought, you know what? I'm not okay with that, ignorance of it. It would seem like a big deal if all of the non-Indigenous people got together and made one statement. I would think that's a miracle, yeah? Almost. So I thought, well, how could we ignore that in that sense? So as time goes on, I have conversations with people, and I have more and more conversations with people, and eventually what pops out after 5 years, because it's been 5 years since the Uluru Statement of the Heart was written, I start to do these sort of things. But there's a process to get there, and the process isn't so much about art as it is about listening to people in our community. Just trying to give you a bit of a background to what it is that I'm trying to produce here, because what I'm after is not so much that you walk up to that piece and go, that's beautiful, although I'm okay if you do say that. What I'm after is that you do something as a response. Does that make sense? So when this is called Remember, that's not just a cute title. It's not trying to be arty-farty about it. Remember's an action word, as Maria just said. It's not that I hope that you remember some things from the past. I hope that you remember some things from our past, and that causes you to remember and act. Because that's the way our God is spoken about. In Christian scriptures, it's often that God remembers someone. But it's not that he went, oh, you know, I forgot. I remember that they're there. It's he remembers and he's going to do something. People are asking for him to remember so that he will do something. It's the same thing with this. So this is the first one, remember. Second one is welcome. Again, I hope that you do something in the welcome. The welcome piece is about us offering a welcome, the non-Indigenous community offering a welcome to our Indigenous brothers and sisters. Not forcing them to accept our welcome, not demanding a timeline on it, not saying that it's got to happen today or it's over, but just patiently, lovingly, trust-buildingly offering and extending a welcome, and it's in their time when they respond. And then the last one's on courage, to do with holding courage long enough that we can see a genuine change in that relationship. I'll leave it there. Thank you for listening. Thank you for looking at it. If you have any comments or questions about it later on, please come and say hello. Very happy to have a chat. It does look like a bunch of sticks. It's intentional. If you stare long enough, you can see things in it. Thanks, Victor.
Thank you, Michael, and thank you so much, Maria, as well. Well, in a moment, I'll invite our two speakers to join me up the front, but let me introduce them. Professor Greg Lehman is currently the Pro-Vice-Chancellor for Aboriginal Leadership at the University of Tasmania. In 2017, Greg led the development of First Tasmanians, the Queen Victoria Museum and Art Gallery's first permanent Indigenous gallery. Together with Tim Bonihatty, he also co-curated the National Picture, The Art of Tasmania's Black War, a major touring exhibition that won the 2019 Museum and Galleries Award Australia for Travelling Exhibitions. Greg is also a previous member of the National Museum of Australia's Indigenous Reference Group and chair of the Tasmanian Museum and Art Gallery's Aboriginal Advisory Council. And there's a whole bunch more, but we need to get underway. He's an award-winning curator and writer, a well-known Tasmanian art historian, and a regular public commentator on Indigenous identity and place. And our second speaker is Tim McCormack. He's a professor of law at the University of Tasmania. He's also a special advisor on war crimes to the prosecutor of the International Criminal Court in The Hague. And Tim was appointed by the Premier of Tasmania in 2021 to support Professor Kate Warner in mapping out a pathway to truth-telling and treaty with Tasmania's Aboriginal people. And so it's with great pleasure that I invite and welcome Greg and Tim to join me here up the front. Thank you. Well, welcome Greg, welcome Tim. We're at a slightly less formal, being not behind the podium now, but thank you so much for joining us this evening. Greg, I wanted to start with you. Can you tell us a little bit about your own story as a Tasmanian Aboriginal? And you've got, I think, some slides to help us along as well.
I do. Only I can't see what's up there. Thank you very much, Victor, for inviting me to be part of this. I would like to talk a little bit about my own family, because I think it's important to understand not just who we're talking about when we talk about Tasmanian Aboriginal people today, but what we're talking about. And by that I mean it's not just characters and political figureheads and commentators and academics or whoever. We're all people who come from somewhere. We come from, we each have our own unique experiences and histories, and come from different places. And in Tasmania, every Tasmanian Aboriginal person today also draws on other ancestries and other histories, and has connections to other homelands and other traditions. So that makes for a fairly complex and multifaceted real human being that often sits fairly quietly behind the perception of the common perception that, oh, that's an Aboriginal person. So I'd like to demystify that a little bit, at least to the extent of my story. Did that slide change?
It should have changed, yeah. We're trying some new technology tonight, so you'll have to bear with us with that.
Yeah. I wish I could see that.
I think you can just open up the slide again.
Just lost it. Won't be a sec. I've just lost my thing that I was looking at. Yeah. Can you maybe talk to Tim for a minute?
Sure.
Just
sure.
while I get this back on my screen.
I'll say a couple of things.
Yeah, please.
While we're working out the technology, and that's to say thank you for the invitation, and it's an honour to be up the front with Greg. I'm really glad that he agreed to be here. I think on the subject of remembering and acknowledging the truth of what's happened here, we would be less authentic with the absence of an Aboriginal person to speak about that. So I'm really glad that he's agreed to be here, and yeah, for me,
Can't hear? Okay, here we go. Maybe we'll all move ourselves a little bit closer.
let's ignore the
There we go.
let's ignore the sticky tape.
Okay, how's that? How are we doing? We're doing a bit better?
Well, he's waiting to hear from me because
Yeah.
I'm the sort of litmus test. Is that better for you? No worries. Yeah. What tragedy.
That'd be good.
There we go. Okay.
I wasn't listening to it all then. So.
I think we're ready to go now.
It's all reasonably
So
positive, Greg.
I mean, I think, Greg, part of why we're sticking with the technology here is because you're an art historian.
Yeah.
And so we wanted to hear from you not only as a kind of representative of the Tasmanian Aboriginal community, but also from your professional expertise. And so, I'm going to ask you a little bit about that. But yes, tell us.
Okay,
Family story. We'll kick off again.
We'll go back to, now that I've got the technology under control, sorry about that. Yes, I am an art historian, and that means that I'm interested not only in the written archive, but more importantly, in fact quite obsessively, I'm interested in the visual archive, because it is so important. We are such visual creatures. And these days we're force-fed our visual world through television, and our visual literacy is quite poor. We've forgotten how to understand art. We've forgotten about the allegory that made the art that came out of the Renaissance so rich, and that has informed and reflected Christian tradition, for example. Those traditions all carry ideas, and the thing that I'm particularly interested in is how colonial art carried ideas, European or particularly British and French ideas about Indigenous people into the new colonies, and basically was a way of instructing or informing colonists what these things called Aborigines were, and by implication how you could deal with them. Now what that led to, of course, is the reason that we're having this conversation tonight, because the colonial impact on my ancestors, my Tasmanian Aboriginal ancestors, was probably more severe on this island than it was anywhere else in Australia. Many Tasmanian Aboriginal people are descended from the man that I'm hoping you can see there, Manalagena. Manalagena he was referred to by the colonial authorities as a chief. His own people referred to him as a clever man. And I think authority came from knowledge and wisdom and probably the ability to run several political agendas at once, more so than power. Can you see a sailing ship? Okay, I won't keep asking now. I'll trust.
We're getting there.
When the first British that arrived here were actually not people that arrived here in 1803 at Risdon Cove, but sealers who arrived in the Bass Strait Islands after the salvage of the wreck of the Sydney Cove brought news back to Sydney that Bass Strait was teeming with seals, and those sealers established a fairly lawless frontier in Bass Strait. And the first thing that they did, which is very common right across the British Empire, was they supplemented their ability to make money by acquiring labour, a form of slavery. Tasmanian Aboriginal women were kidnapped or traded from the tribes, particularly around the northeast of Tasmania, which is where my tribal origins are. And the sealers discovered very early on that Tasmanian Aboriginal women were actually very skilled in hunting seals. In fact, for ceremonial reasons, they were the only people allowed to hunt seals. Men did not hunt seals. The people, those women that I'm talking about, are women like this. This was a photograph taken in 1866. This woman's name is Wapiti. Her other name is Watania Kutamina, which means thunder and lightning. she is one of Munalagena's daughters, and I'm descended from another one of Munalagena's daughters called Waritamotiena. Her name refers to the black peppermint gum that grows on the coast of the northeast coast of Tasmania. Unfortunately, we don't have a photograph of her, so this is my tribal auntie. Those women, had children to the sealers, and it was ironically the stealing and the possession and often the abuse of these women at the hands of the sealers, and of course the progeny that inevitably resulted from that, that guaranteed the survival of Tasmanian Aboriginal people. And it was the resilience of those women sharing and passing on their knowledge to those children that ensured that Tasmanian Aboriginal culture survives today. This is the great niece of the woman Wapiti that you saw earlier on. Her name was Jane, and she married Thomas Herbst, who was an Irishman. And this is a photograph of them on their Dunorlan property. They were farmers. They kind of soaked into the social fabric of the hinterland of the north coast of Tasmania, and pretty much as Maria had said before, she was probably known to be Aboriginal, but in those days it was probably barely spoken. I said I wouldn't make this a lecture, so I'll just hop along a bit quicker. This is my father's grandmother, Mary Christina Kennedy, and with a name like that, you could guess that her father was an Irishman as well. This is a photo of her aboard one of the predecessors of the Spirit of Tasmania, actually before the Princess of Tasmania, the Taruna, which used to ply the run from Devonport to Melbourne. You can see there she's wearing a kangaroo skin coat, and I would dearly, dearly love to know where that coat is, if it had survived. These are my parents and my grandfather. My father, Patrick Kennedy Lehman, is my Aboriginal parent. His wife, Lorna Lehman, who was a chug from Longford. Somebody in this room is guaranteed to know a chug from Longford. And on the far left is Wesley Lehman, and he was descended from Bavarian immigrants who arrived in Tasmania in 1855. And that, of course, brings us to me. And this is me with my Roger Ramjet ray gun, valiantly fighting off invaders at the tender age of 4 or 5. And it's a habit that's died hard because I'm still busy trying to fight off invaders, or at least enrich our understanding of what happened here in Tasmania. Stop there.
Yeah, thank you so much for sharing a little bit about your family history there, Greg. And we'll hear from you in a little bit, Tim. But Greg, can I ask you, as an art historian specialising in colonial art, you've talked a little bit about why visual history is important in telling the truth about our past. I wonder if you can tell us maybe a little bit more about that, and also how does colonial art both tell and conceal the truth about colonisation and its impact on the Aboriginal people of Tasmania?
It's a very good question, and what inspires me and makes me think that art history is so worthwhile is that thing that I mentioned before about the lack of visual literacy in Australia today, in fact right across the Western world. we don't, and this is a lovely quote from John Berger, Ways of Seeing. If people don't have a copy of that book, it's a little thin paperback that you can read in a day, and it's if you want a wonderful insight into an introduction to art history, go and get a copy of Ways of Seeing. The world that we see is intriguing, and there's always more to that world than is apparent on the surface. And the way that I try to introduce that to people is to talk about visual rhetoric. We understand the idea of rhetoric. This is something that's being said or being written that has a purpose, that has an intention, and it might be quite a devious intention. Humour, aggression, irony, these are all rhetorical devices that add to the story, that add to the subtext of what you're saying. The same thing applies with... I've discovered I can see a reflection in the glass doors down the back, so I'm right now.
Yeah, that's cool.
The same thing applies to images. This is an image that became quite well known in Australia around the turn of the last century, around the time of Federation. And it shows this grand and powerful, illustrious icon of the British Empire and colonialism, Captain James Cook, standing on the beach at our very own Adventure Bay. And of course, the Aboriginal people are just, it's like they're being blinded by the sight of God. They can barely cope with his presence. They're cowering. This is something that really reassures, and it's intended to bolster the pride of an Australian readership in their membership of the British Empire. And I remember growing up in the 1960s, some of the older generation still referred to England as home, even though they'd never been there, even though they were third or fourth generation Tasmanians. They would talk about a relation going home. So that's the rhetorical product of this sort of imagery. So in contrast, this is the closest thing that we've got to a photograph of Captain James Cook landing on the beach at Adventure Bay on Bruny Island, not far from here. And it's a sketch that was drawn by his artist, John Webber. I've been down there and ground truthed this sketch against the backdrop of the landscape, and it is incredibly detailed and incredibly accurate. Some of you might know this place. It's called Two Tree Point Watering Place, Cook's Landing Place. It's got a small memorial there to Cook. And it shows Cook meeting with a clever man who'd stepped forward to parley with him. I don't know whether you can make it out there, but Cook's reaching out, and his journal describes what he's doing. He's presenting a medal to this man as a gift from the Crown. And there were several dozen of these medals, especially minted for Cook's second and third voyages, which were distributed to native people of the South Pacific. We actually found one of these medals. We don't know that he only gave out one, but one of them was found in a paddock at Kalora, and it may well be the very medal that he's presenting there. So this is an image not of people cowering, of a hapless and parlous savages in awe of an icon of empire. It's a meeting of equals. Very, very different story, but that wouldn't have served the interests of the empire around the time of Federation. The other thing that John Webber left us with is this beautifully human portrait of that clever man who stepped forward to speak with Cook. Incidentally, the Cook's party were made very welcome. The men who came back to see them day after day ended up helping them cut timber and shape a foremast, because the only reason that they pulled in there is they damaged their rigging. So this was a very, very different picture And if there's any rhetoric embedded in this drawing, I think it's one of respect and a way of acknowledging and admiring a fellow human being. Something that was lost very quickly in the early decades of the colony. So there's just a little window into why I'm an obsessive art historian. Hopefully you can see why from that.
What year was the second and third expeditions of Cook?
Cook landed at Adventure Bay on January the 30th, 1777. So this was 7 years after the famous 1770 discovery of Australia. Of course, the idea of it being discovered for the first time was nonsense, not only because Aboriginal people have been living and been familiar with the continent for a couple of thousand generations, but actually the Portuguese and the Dutch had been here, and probably before them, maybe even the Chinese. Yeah. And there's actually, the British discovered New Zealand flax on Maria Island when they first arrived there too, which suggests that Maori people probably visited even before that.
Tim, can I bring you into the conversation a little bit? We've heard, Greg, some of your own family story, and I mean, thank you so much for showing the family photos as well. That is just fantastic. I know Tim doesn't have family photos with us today, but Tim, can you tell us a little bit about some of your story as Tasmanian yourself? I have to say, I'm a Johnny-come-lately to this conversation. I only arrived here about 10 years ago, but yeah, Tim, can you tell us a little bit about maybe your childhood, sure. Growing up around Burnie, and yeah, maybe a little bit about faith in your family, and also your perceptions growing up about Tasmanian Aboriginal people.
Yeah, sure. I'd also love seeing Greg's family photos. I've seen Manalaganna, I've seen the images of his daughter, but not great-grandparents and grandfather and mum and dad and Ronnie Ray gun holder himself. So that was really great. I used to be proud of being fifth-generation Tasmanian. I am no longer, because now understanding that there were 2,000 generations of Aboriginal people here makes all of that pale into insignificance. But my great-great-grandfather, John Charles Chas McCormack, was transported in 1845, so quite late in transportation. It finished in 1853. He disembarked in Hobart in October. Can you hear me? Okay. Hello. My great-great-grandfather, John Charles Chas McCormack, was transported and arrived in Hobart in October 1845. He had not stolen a loaf of bread or, some other thing. He was part of the Irish Regiment, pre-Irish independence. So the Irish Regiment was, of course, a regiment of the British Army, and he was sentenced to 14 years hard labour in Van Diemen's Land because he assaulted his superior officer. I don't know whether the bloke deserved it or not, but, it's sort of a great story in our family. Yeah, I grew up in the northwest coast, like everybody, mixed ancestry. So my McCormack name comes from my Irish convict ancestor, but there's also convict ancestry on my mum's side. There's some Dutch, there's some Spanish, there's some English, Scottish. It's a mixture. Growing up in the northwest coast, I had always been led to believe as a child that Aboriginality died out in Tasmania with Truganini, and I had no reason not to believe that. It wasn't really until I was made the big move from the northwest coast to the metropolis of Hobart as an 18-year-old to study law, and was in the same year as Michael Mansell and Heather Scolthorpe was a year above us, that I had that extinction myth exploded for me in my interactions with those two. So I'm really grateful that my own children's generation and the next generation are being taught a far different truth about what happened here. But yes, we certainly did grow up in a faith community. Anyone who knows the northwest coast of the 1960s, 70s, 80s could not know of the Christian Brethren movement, which permeated the whole of the, not just the coast from sort of Port Sorell all the way through to Marrawar, but also the hinterland right back into the communities. I remember travelling with my dad as a lay preacher to Tewkesbury and Highclere and Prialina and Moorbanner and, you know, all these places, North Motton, all sorts of places when he went to preach at Brethren churches. Fortunately for us, we grew up in the open Brethren, not in the closed or exclusive Brethren. I'd be a very different person, I think, if I'd had an exclusive Brethren background. But I'd say that upbringing in the... Yep. All right. That upbringing in my experience did not lead me to a deep conviction as a young person about the importance of justice and responding to injustice. I often sometimes get asked about the question, how do you end up in investigation and prosecution of war crimes? Is it because, you know, something happened back in the childhood? I think the spirituality that I grew up with, or the theology that I grew up with, was not a socially engaged theology. It was more that the world's stuffed, it's always going to be that way, it won't change until Jesus comes back again, so really there's no point in trying to make a difference, which I thought was, you know, that was the environment, I think. And for me, it was much more about growing into adulthood, becoming interested in international law, being challenged to think about seeing the study or the path, a career path that I was interested in pursuing from a biblical perspective that changed my thinking about, particularly changed my thinking about those things.
Yeah, thank you, Tim. And I'm really interested in that intersection for you with your expertise and your professional work in that international law space. The Polish lawyer Raphael Lemkin coined the term genocide and helped the initiation of the convention, UN Convention Against Genocide. And he considered a genocide to have happened here in Tasmania. It was one of the examples that he used. Now, I know that is contested by different historians. Nevertheless, you know, he's the guy who coined the term. I'm really interested, Tim, for you, how is your work in that international space on international justice, what's that brought for you coming kind of back home to consider, all right, we're going to switch over to these. Let's see how we go. How's that work in that international space and then coming back home impacted how you see Tasmania's history?
Yeah. I'd been thinking for some time about the possibility of coming back to Tassie. I felt like I left my heart here when we moved to the mainland. It's a conversation that Cara and I had over many years. This timing of late 2017, applying for the deanship at the law school here and then applying successfully gave us the opportunity to come back. And I'm really grateful for that. It was good timing for us as a family because of the stage of education that our youngest was at the time. And I was thinking a lot about what does it mean to be the dean of the only law school in Tasmania. I was very keen that we be a law school committed to not the law as an end in itself, but as a means to a more just and fair society. That as a law school we would nurture colleagues who wanted to speak out against injustice and ensure that the students understood that was a key value of the place. And as I reflected on what I thought were some of the big injustices in Tasmania, this is certainly one of them. And so when I first arrived and my first day in the job, I said that. I got a little bit emotional about it, but I said that I thought the failure to resolve the unresolved issues about the treatment of Tasmanian Aboriginal people when colonial settlers arrived, invaded and dispossessed them their land, but the ongoing consequences of that are something that I want to take very seriously as Dean of the Law School and make sure that we prioritise and value, and everybody who comes through here knows that. Kate Warner was at that morning tea, and she took me under her wing to give me some advice and encouragement.
Fantastic. And I remember in our conversations kind of leading up to this, you said in your international experience you've kind of seen different nations grappling with their past. What have you seen, I guess, that informs thinking about here, and for nations that have kind of failed to really do justice to what has happened in the past, and how that might impact as you kind of training students here, and what you think needs to happen here?
I think the first exposure to that concept for me was in relation to the Balkans, when I was first appointed to by the judges in the trial of Slobodan Milosevic, the former president of the former Yugoslavia and then president of Serbia. And I went to The Hague multiple times over a 4-year period of my involvement in the trial. And I was on a pretty steep learning curve, I think, about the conflicts in the Balkans. I knew sort of roughly about some of the things that happened, but of course I became much more familiar with many of the historical details because of the charges against Mr. Milosevic, the evidence that was adduced in court against him, the witnesses that were called. And there were so many references to the key battle in the 12th century between the Serbs and the Croats that no one ever forgotten about. And lots of discussion about the process of a criminal trial, a series of criminal trials to hold individuals accountable, being part of assisting a society collectively to grapple with the consequences of the trauma that's been inflicted, the widespread damage that's happened. How do we move on from that? Because I'd learned about the South African Truth and Reconciliation process, but this was really the first up close and personal involvement. I'm not trying to suggest that I was affected as a victim of the armed conflict. I don't mean to trivialise it, of course. But then, having been involved now for 12 years with the International Criminal Court, I see a similar pattern in all the conflict situations that I've had to give advice about. And they involve many African situations: Rwanda, Democratic Republic of the Congo, Uganda, Sudan, Libya. The list sort of seems to go on and on outside of the African context. The Russian invasion of Georgia, Afghanistan, the Israeli occupation of the West Bank and Gaza and Palestine, and now, of course, Ukraine. And we're spending a lot of time talking about the situation in Ukraine. And there is a common theme about a desire for, a need for the role of criminal trials and accountability to enable a society to grapple with what's happened and to move on. I'm not suggesting there should be criminal trials here, but I do genuinely and deeply believe that until we as a society, and I mean Tasmanian society and Australian society nationally, come to grips with the history of our interaction, our invasion and dispossession of our Indigenous people, we won't truly flourish as a society.
Greg, I know you've got a whole bunch more slides for us. Kind of following on from what Tim's been saying, can you maybe take us through just a little bit of what some of the things that have happened here in our past in Tasmania? Because it seems to me that that criminal setting, Tim, allows for an examination of what has happened, and that's kind of the ground zero. That's what we need to do, is that talking about the past and rightly remembering it. So, hand over to you, Greg.
Thanks, Victor. I might just go for it. Yeah. I'm glad that you mentioned Raphael Lemkin, because the argument that gets battered around amongst historians that, questions on technical grounds whether or not what happened in Tasmania or Van Diemen's Land should correctly be called genocide or not is really frustrating for me, because it creates this back door, and people can go, oh, thank God for that. No, definitely not. Genocide is something that happens in Rwanda. It's something that happens in the Balkans. It's something that happened in Europe in the middle of last century. But it doesn't happen in Australia. We're exceptional in that things here are really nice and everybody's lovely and there's a fair go and everyone's mates. That's a whole bunch of rhetoric which conjures up this idea of contemporary Australia. I'll just show a couple of slides that I like to use to try and just really overturn that idea. The first one that you'll see there is a map that Lyndall Ryan put together for her wonderful book, The Aboriginal Tasmanians. Again, if you're looking for a book that's got a really, really good summary of the Aboriginal history of Tasmania from the last ice age through to late last century, 1980s, 1990s, please have a look at Lyndall's book. The point that I want to make there is that there were probably close to 100 different clans living across the island. Those shaded areas on the map. Can you see the map? Yeah. I can see it. Roughly correspond to areas of different languages. There were 12 different languages in Tasmania, linguistically different. The languages that were neighbouring, just like French and Italian, were quite closely connected and shared lots of content. But when the people from the southwest of Tasmania were brought together by the British on Flinders Island with the people from the northeast, they couldn't understand each other. The languages were so different. So lots of cultural diversity. The next slide is a map that was produced for the House of Commons in 1831 by order of Governor George Arthur. It was produced by Franklin, the principal surveyor. And I'm not sure whether you can make out, there's a series of red lines stretching across the map. This is what was referred to at the time as the Black Line. And what it was a military operation. This occurred during a time of martial law. The governor had declared martial law, which enabled colonists to use the words of the proclamation, to treat Aboriginal people who were found in what they called the settled districts, to treat them as an open enemy, which effectively meant they could be shot on sight. The Black Line involved allocation of over half the colony's entire annual budget. Huge amount of money. to arm and equip every able-bodied man, convict, constable, free settler in the colony to be stretched in a series of cordons that stretched from the Western Tiers in the north right across to St Patrick's Head on the west coast, on the east coast. And these lines, these cordons, were to move systematically across the landscape, and the idea was that they would drive Aboriginal people who were still occupying their traditional land, which the British had declared was now off limits to them. And the idea was to drive them down to Eaglehawk Neck, where they could all be captured and sent off to an island where they would no longer be a danger to the colonists, and also to give some credit to Governor Arthur, who was an evangelical Christian, where they would be protected from the depredations of the colonists that was happening out there on the frontier. The whole exercise, and I might add that this is Australia's first example of permanent offshore detention as a policy response to dealing with people that you do not want in your country. That's 1831. We're still doing it today. The whole thing was a spectacular failure. They captured one old man and a boy and killed one man. If that was to happen anywhere, and correct me if I'm wrong, Tim, as an international law scholar, if this was to happen anywhere in the world today, I have no doubt that it would be referred to as a classic case of ethnic cleansing. Yet, if you were to stand up at Salamanca Market and yell at the top of your voice that Tasmania had experienced ethnic cleansing, I think most people who heard you would think you were mad, that you'd had too much medicinal cannabis. But this is the evidence. This is not the opinion of lefty historians. This is a document that was produced to make a very careful account of a military operation in the colony that we now call home. And that, I think, is that's one of the things that creates the legacy that brings us together today, and that generates the need for processes of truth-telling and healing.
So I think you can hold on to that one. Are we going? There we go. Okay, you can hear me. There we go. We each have our own mics now. We'll get there in the end. Myself as a newcomer to this place, I mean, I grew up in Papua New Guinea, and my parents were missionaries there. Their focus was on recording simple Bible stories in other languages. And so their work, my parents' work, was with minority languages, very small languages. My dad recorded in one language that had only 100 people, probably doesn't exist anymore. And so for me as a newcomer to Tasmania, learning about this history and, learning about the 12 different languages, all those clan groups, there's a deep, deep sense of sadness that I have that these languages have been lost. One of the visions for my parents that kind of motivated them in their work was a picture from the book of Revelation of people from every nation and tribe and language gathered around the throne, praising the Lamb. And that was, that's, I take it, a sense of the value and dignity that God places on every people group, every ethnic group, every language, every culture, because so much of culture is carried in language. And so to come here and find out that this is what's happened here. Palawakani is an amazing academic achievement, and yet it's picking up the pieces of something which has been profoundly shattered. And so there's a great sense of sadness for me. And I suppose that's one of the themes of our time tonight is thinking about that idea of lament, and maybe lament as a starting place for owning a shared history, because it isn't just an Aboriginal history and it isn't just a white history, it's actually when the two have come together. So I wonder, if either of you guys would like to maybe to speak about lament as a starting place. Maybe Tim, if you've had some experience in thinking about this in terms of your own engagement with the scriptures, and Greg, I know you've in that visual history there is some really striking examples of lament as well. So I'm not sure who's going to go first there. Go for it, Tim.
Thanks, Victor. You're right. You're right to feel sad because it's a monumental loss. And it isn't, of course, just the loss of language. The reason those languages are lost is because the people that spoke them were obliterated. So I'm relieved that you feel so sad about it, and we all should. I mean, we acknowledge the Muanina people as the traditional owners and custodians of the land of Hobart, the land we meet on tonight. But we know of no descendants of the Muanina people. Can't say absolutely there aren't any, but we can't acknowledge the present and emerging elders of the Muanina people. In fact, I think I heard last week, I'm not sure about this, Greg, but they were gone in 25 years after colonial arrival, invasion, 1803, so before 1830. That's a shocking, and that's not unique, of course. This is replicated around the state. So it's right to feel sad. And yes, in preparation for tonight, I've been thinking a lot about lament, partly because of our many conversations about it, the three of us, as well as you and I, Victor. Greg just, whispered to me when Michael was talking about his desire that remembering evokes some action. Lament is a response to remembering the truth. I was thinking about the fact that we don't have, we all lament individually for all sorts of reasons. We grieve with family, we grieve with friends of people we've lost who we love. But as a society, I don't think we have rituals around collective lament, although somehow or other it happens spontaneously sometimes. So for the Hillcrest tragedy last year, with those kids dying as a result of falling out of a jumping castle in Devonport, community just rallied in collective grief in response to that. So it can happen when an event triggers it. And I've been thinking about lament in the Bible. The fact that there's a book called Lamentations in the canon of Scripture is a great thing because it affirms the natural human inclination to respond in grief to tragedy, and to do it individually and collectively is endorsed in the inclusion of that book. It is, of course, a lament by the people of Israel for the sacking of Jerusalem and their exile to Babylon. And when we are reflecting on the history here, those of us who are not Aboriginal ought to be, I think, lamenting not our own grief, although we indirectly have experienced it as well, but the loss and the tragedy that has been handed out and the intergenerational consequences that flow from that, which I think sometimes is way too easily overlooked. The view that it happened so long ago, we just got to get over it and move on. Well, you have to, the Aboriginal people, you collectively, the Aboriginal people have to move on. And I wasn't alive then. I'm not personally responsible. This is a gross oversimplification and something that really needs to be challenged and thought through, because our societal responsibility and our benefit, actually, as non-Aboriginal people from the consequences of invasion and dispossession are very significant. We need to acknowledge them.
This is a big problem. The thing that some people use to try and distance themselves and emphasise their innocence or their lack of guilt in relation to what happened on this island 3 grandmothers ago is it's not enough. It's insufficient. I don't think that. I like to think that forgiveness, a collective moment of forgiveness might be possible as one of the things that could occur as a result of a really genuine and powerful and honest process of truth-telling. That would certainly be a catalyst for healing if that was to occur. But I don't know whether redemption is possible because we cannot change, no matter how much we like to invest history with rhetoric visually or textually, or deny things like, people like Keith Windshuttle was trying to do at the behest of a certain Prime Minister whose name I won't mention. That won't fix it. That doesn't provide redemption. We can, contrition is possible, and I think that's something that then creates that potential for lament and for action. But we've got to be wary, because these states of lament have occurred before in Van Diemen's Land. The image that you can see now is a painting. Some of you will have seen it in the Tasmanian Museum and Art Gallery. It's often referred to as the Conciliation by Benjamin Diderot, who was a Huguenot Englishman who arrived here in 1832. He was the first artist to arrive here, an academically trained artist who took an interest in Aboriginal people. And my theory is he did so because of his Huguenot ancestry. His grandparents, I discovered, were both imprisoned in France simply for being Protestant after the revocation of the Treaty of Nantes. His family would have had a memory of the St. Bartholomew's Day massacres. 5,000 people on the streets of Paris alone were killed in one day. He understood what massacres were. He understood what genocidal intents were, and I think he recognised that that's something that was happening here. This picture he actually called the national picture, and it was painted to do 2 things: to lament what would have been considered the terrible necessity of an inferior race bowing to the imperial superiority of the British. But it also, he calls it the national picture because it's also meant to mark a moment where a nation, the beginnings, the building blocks of a nation. The British never considered that Van Diemen's Land would just be a state in a federation. They considered that it could give rise to a nation in itself. And the Aboriginal person who's pictured shaking hands with the guy in the hat, who happens to be George Augustus Robinson, is in the process of reaching an agreement, making a treaty. And there was an agreement made at that moment which basically said, if you Aboriginal people will put yourselves under our protection, we'll take you to Waibalena on Flinders Island, where your needs will be met, you'll be protected from the settlers, and then when the war is over, you'll be allowed to return, and then you can live you can live with all the rights of a subject of the crown. Now that second part was never allowed to happen. the Aboriginal people weren't permitted to leave Waibelena. It was never intended that they leave. They were only able to leave after some of the younger men who'd been educated through the catechism and the school there learned to read and write and wrote a petition to Queen Victoria. And after a chain of events, Waibelena was closed down. This painting was intended by the artist to be hung in the Parliament as a memorial to the costs of the colonial endeavour and the result, that is the beginnings of this nation that would grow out of the colony of Van Diemen's Land. The next image is another memorial, and this one was created by one of Van Diemen's Land's first famous photographers. He was also the first Bishop of Hobart, Francis Nixon, and he travelled to Oyster Cove, not far from Hobart, to take photographs of the Aboriginal people these are the survivors of the Black War, the Black Line. These are the people who survived Waibelena. Around 200 people were sent to Waibelena on Flinders Island. When it was closed in 1847, there were less than 50 people still left alive. And I think Nixon was documenting this. I can't presume to speak for what he was thinking, but as a bishop, you tell me, why would a man in the 1860s with that set of responsibilities go to a place and create? He took many photographs. You can find them online if you go to Libraries Tasmania and look at the digitised images that they've got there. And finally, this is one of the most famous paintings by one of the most famous colonial artists from Van Diemen's Land, and that's John Glover. It looks like an idyllic scene where you've got in the foreground Aboriginal people I don't know whether you can quite make them out from down the back there, but Aboriginal people are dancing, they're cooking a meal around a fire, they're swimming and playing and diving in the water, harvesting shellfish out of the Derwent, which back in those days you could eat the shellfish that came out of the Derwent.
No zinc works in.
Somebody's walking back with a kangaroo over their shoulders. This is a testament to another artist who had great sympathy for Aboriginal people. He wrote about a corroboree that he witnessed up in the north of Tasmania, of Van Diemen's Land. He said that he had never witnessed so much gaiety, even in the great ballrooms of Europe, as he witnessed Aboriginal people enjoying their culture on their own country. The problem with this image is that it is absolutely drenched in visual rhetoric. The first problem is that when this was painted in 1835, the people that he had placed in the foreground of this landscape were no longer on their country. They had been dispossessed of their country and sent to this permanent offshore detention at Waibelena on Flinders Island. And there was nothing to celebrate. So this is a construction, but it was done. I think I'll give Glover some credit here. It was done, I think, with the best of intentions. He was wanting to express lament for the cost, for the absence. By placing these people in the landscape, he was wanting to lament their absence. The other thing, the other little rhetorical device that I'll just mention, which is quite typical of picturesque painters at the time, is you'll notice that Quinani or Mount Wellington and the foothills where you can see the buildings of Hobart town is drenched in morning sunlight. This is a moment, this is a dawn, it's a moment of new beginnings. The foreground, where he's placed the Aboriginal people, is in shadow. This is the preceding moment. This is the past that is already receding into into a distant memory, and hence the urging by the painter to remember these people. So these are moments when the colony joined together with artists to lament what had happened. They're moments of memorial, of remembrance. But they don't last. They weren't followed up with any action. And I think one of the big challenges that we have with the prospect of a pathway towards treaty and truth-telling is to, as Michael mentioned earlier this evening, is to translate that into meaningful action, into something that's lasting, that won't just pass away.
Now, I realise that we've been having a great conversation, and we've got about 15 minutes to go before we've said to finish up.
No questions yet.
No, we haven't had questions yet from the floor. Greg, was there anything else that you wanted to just tell us about before I open up to the floor?
Look, I think the Requiem video goes for about 3 minutes, so I can fit that in.
Okay.
And that might just take us to a place where
We can open up, yeah.
Yeah. So these are all the slides you miss out on. Sorry. How does he fit orange-bellied parrots into this talk, you're wondering? So one of the projects one of the most difficult and challenging and risky projects that I've ever been involved with was a thing called a Tasmanian Requiem. Sorry, one of the most challenging projects I've been involved with was a thing called a Tasmanian Requiem. Anybody here saw it? I saw it. Yeah. Oh, that's great. Very experimental. If we did it again, we'd probably do it slightly differently. But the challenge was to take the tradition of the Christian Requiem and to re-enliven it in the context of Tasmania's colonial history, and try and look for opportunities of healing in our own experience, in our own backyard. And I used a couple of, I won't go into that. Wilfred Owen, people know Wilfred Owen's war poems inspired Karl Orff's Requiem, I think. Yes. And T.S. Eliot, Other Echoes Inhabit the Garden, from the famous poem Burnt Norton. The fact that the past never leaves us. There are always whispers that remind us of the things that we're uncertain of. I wonder whether you could click on the link at the bottom of...
So is this for the video for us to see? Yeah, okay. I think the guys have got it lined up.
Oh, cool. Okay.
Yeah.
Great.
So we might...
So this is just a very short video which talks about the Requiem, and we might finish it with the end of that video and go to questions.
We want to launch a massive creative tirade against the horrors of colonisation in Tasmania. It's not about hitting people around the head. We want to also at the same time acknowledge that there was some naivety and innocence and foolishness on the part of many of the people that were involved in the things that happened in Tasmania. So I'd like to think that something of a better connection with place and the responsibilities that come with all of that might emerge from this as well.
The two words Tasmanian and Requiem, they do seem to actually work quite well to illustrate an idea that we're trying to put into something a bit more concrete visually and musically and textually, to give an opportunity to, I suppose, publicly atone and acknowledge, and I think in some ways provide people who have come to Tasmania who feel that sense of grief or, sadness in the land, or who are descendants of colonists who are aware of what happened. It's an opportunity for them, I suppose, to come together and support that idea and be there for when that actually happens.
Requiem is very much an international story. We're focusing on what happened here, but it's global. The idea of invasion and aftermath. We've got here people saying settlers, and then the middle term is colonists, and then there's invaders. And 99% of people out on the streets will say, oh, they were settlers. And we're not all on the same page, but how to bring something together that expresses what went on.
How can we grieve? How can we heal? How can we move forward? So many of us are in such a place of denial around not only what's happened, but the fact that there's still a vibrant Aboriginal culture here that's ongoing and that should be celebrated by all of us. A requiem is a pretty unique thing. It's an opportunity for grief, for saying goodbye, for healing, and for peace, and potentially for moving on out of that place of grief.
Hopefully on the screen we can call up the Slido number that you can text your questions in. We do already have a couple of questions that have come in, and so I've got the first one here. Greg, do you feel hopeful that we can change the national settler-invader psyche, given that we have that history?
If I spent my time only talking to people of my age or older, I might despair a little and perhaps say I'm not sure. But my answer is absolutely, it's inevitable. And it gives me just completely irresistible optimism about the future. And the reason that I say that is because I can see what younger people, I've got children aged between 32 and 22, and I've seen them and their peers. I've heard them speak. I see what they want to do, and I just know that they are not going to be constrained by those shadows that my generation and earlier generations have feared. And it is the events here have left a very long shadow. But a young person can just realises that they can step out of that shadow. It's actually quite easy.
So maybe this is a question for both of you. What are the most important things to get right in moving toward a meaningful treaty in Lutruwita? It's a hard question. What are the most important things to get right?
Well, I think the truth has to be told, because that's important for non-Aboriginal Tasmania to accept as a foundation for what are we actually negotiating about.
But I actually think even more important than that is the one thing that has to be got right is that Aboriginal people are given the freedom to negotiate what they want for their own future. And I feel like what we don't have is a commitment. What we don't have yet is a commitment on the part of non-Aboriginal Tasmania or Australia to autonomy and self-determination by the Aboriginal people. That's a precondition. It has to be them that say, these are the things we want to sit down and negotiate. And the government's got to come to the table in good faith. Otherwise they're telling the Aboriginal people yet again what we're going to agree on, or what the limits of what we're prepared to negotiate are.
I think the most important thing is Desmond Tutu said about the Truth and Reconciliation Commission in South Africa that it's not about forgiveness, it's about listening. And I think that's the most essential thing as part of the truth-telling process, and an absolute prerequisite for a successful treaty is a deep and profound ability to listen. And that's not just non-Aboriginal people. A reconciliation involves multiple parties coming together. There also has to be some deep and profound listening on the part of Aboriginal people as well. And I think if we can somehow or another nourish an environment that allows that sort of deep listening to happen, then we've got a pretty good chance of having a treaty that will generate really meaningful things that people will have a very strong and compelling sense of ownership of. That's what will make it work. A treaty which has a whole bunch of aspects which people feel have been imposed on them is a missed opportunity.
Do you have any ideas or suggestions as to how we as a state can lament and maybe set up a practice of recognition and lament over our past? Maybe while you guys think about that, I know as the Anglican Church in 2018, Bishop Richard led all the churches across the diocese in a season of lament and repentance for some of our past sins and failures. And there were a number of different areas that we looked at, but one of those was our complicity in the dispossession and destruction of Aboriginal culture. And Bishop Richard had a time with every parish in the diocese where people could come and speak about the past and grieve and mourn over that. So that was something that we did in the Anglican Church. It was a one-off moment in 2018. Any ideas from either of you as maybe something we might be able to do on a state level?
Some of you might remember a few years ago we let loose the Mona vision for Macquarie Point. That's still, I think, alive, I hope, albeit happening at a glacial pace. Glacial is a word that comes to mind for Macquarie Point for more reasons than one. The idea behind that was to create, it's kind of like an anti-monument. I mean, there's no point building a concrete monument right next to the cenotaph. It's just, you're on a loser trying to do that. What we decided was to actually create a space rather than a monument, a space that could be filled, could be activated, and the idea that David Walsh and Lee Carmichael and I put together as this vision was to create a space that the the people of Tasmania could come together and Aboriginal culture could be shared and acknowledged. The suffering of Aboriginal people could be remembered and mourned, and the resilience and survival of Aboriginal culture could be celebrated and shared. And that combination of regret and celebration, I think, would be a wonderful and energetic thing that could continue through all sorts of iterations. There could be temporary installations of sculpture competitions. There could be performances and concerts. There could be markets. There could be protests. All sorts of things could activate this space in the name of sharing and listening and celebrating.
Greg and others of like mind shared that vision with Kate and I when we were involved in our project. And so we made a recommendation about the importance of a place that is Aboriginal owned and managed and controlled, where people who visit understand that they are going into an Aboriginal space. And I thought it's a magnificent vision. I wish we had a designated focal place. But I also would say, so I'm with Greg on that for sure, and it's not for me to say what the Aboriginal people want, but I think as Tasmanian society we need a designated space. But I'm really grateful to the Bishop for the 2018 initiative, because I think that it wasn't just a one-off event. As a consequence of that, I see the evidence of the journey that the institution of the Anglican Church is on. I think it's terrific that during Dark Mofo, the Aboriginal flags flying from the tower at St David's, and that wouldn't happen by chance. That's not coincidental. So, but I also feel very strongly that as the sort of colonial institution, the church of the colonial authorities, the Anglican Church has a special responsibility. And I hope that, and again, not for me to tell you guys what to do, but I hope that the 2018 process, which was internal, could manifest in more public demonstration of the church acknowledging publicly its sins. It's not all negative. Celebrate some of the good parts of the story as well, but to do it in a way that demonstrates what could happen through collective lament, acknowledging what we've done. I think that could have benefits for many others who would not consider themselves Anglican.
One of the things that I really, fortunately we don't have time, and you haven't asked me to talk about my own experiences with the church. But one of the things that I always enjoy reading, because you get a bit of a laugh out of it, and occasionally there's a few profound things scattered amongst it, is that double-page spread in the Mercury every Easter, when the various faith leaders publish a couple of columns of their thoughts on Easter and the meaning of Easter. Imagine if that was to happen, where all of the leaders of all of the various iterations of Christianity and beyond could speak their own perspectives on truth-telling and justice and treaty and the value of Aboriginal culture and reconciliation. I think that would be a wonderful moment.
It's just the bishop.
Yeah.
Not just the bishop. The archbishop.
I feel like we really have only just opened up the conversation tonight, but it's been an absolute pleasure to chair this time and to hear from both of you, Tim and Greg. Why don't we give our guests a round of applause?
Thanks, Greg.
And I've just got, if I can get my notes here, a few things I wanted to let you know about before we finish up for this evening. You're very welcome to stick around after tonight to continue the conversation. We've got some mulled wine and fire pits out on the green, and if it is too cold out there, you're welcome to come back inside as well. Thank you so much for coming tonight, and for those who've registered via email, we will be sending you a short 5-minute survey. We'd love to hear your feedback on tonight, on how we can improve it for next year. I know that there's some very straightforward things that we can do with our microphones, but look forward to hearing back from you. You may see as you head out a postcard that looks like this. It says, it's called Deeper Conversations. This is a space that we have at St. George's to have conversations we're not having about the deeper issues which confront and divide us in the context of hospitality and friendship. Translate that as come over to my place for a chinwag just next door. Everything's on the table. Each person is valued. We meet on the first and third Monday of the month. And our format is a book club. And our next book is going to be Stan Grant's book on identity. So I'm really looking forward to that conversation. If you want to find out more about that, just take one of these and drop us a line to let us know that you're coming, and we can get your book as well. And of course, you're welcome to join us any Sunday here at St. George's at 8 and 10. Our 10 o'clock service has a kids program as well. We'd love to see you. We meet together to sing, to pray, to read from the scriptures, to reflect on life together. And we're a diverse community. Not everyone is a believer, but everyone is welcome. If you want to contribute to helping put tonight on, there's a tap and go on the table on your right as you head out, which is set to $5, so you can make use of that. And I think that is about all from me. But I just want to say thank you to everyone who's been able to put tonight on. It's a huge effort to go into this. I think it's about 20 different people from in different teams working to put on tonight. So I just want to say thank you to all of you. And maybe can we just give everyone a bit of a hand? Thank you, Michael, for inviting us and asking us to host one of your sculptures. It's been such a blessing to have that, to provoke some of that deeper reflection that we need to do, particularly as the Anglican Church, as Tim has said. And if you haven't had a look at Michael's sculpture, I encourage you to do have a look at that. You can scan the QR code to find out more information from his website as you head out. And the last thing to do is to thank you, Tim and Greg, for your time and your gifts, your experience, sharing of yourselves personally as well. That's what I was hoping for, and we've heard a little bit of your own stories. I'm really thankful for that. We have just a couple of gifts to give each of you. We've got a little hamper. So Michael and whoever else the assistant is can come down. We've got a little hamper, and also St. George's has our very own winemakers, Frida Henskins and David Rankin, who have got a bottle. Yeah. Yes, I think they are here. Yeah, so thank you. Okay. Do you want to tell us a story? Go for it. Yeah.
Are the Rankins here?
I can't see because I've got the light in my eyes, but hopefully they're watching online.
All right. Well, let's. I want to say something about this. Karen and I took some dear friends, almost lifelong, 30 plus years of friendship, out to celebrate Miriam's birthday to Fico, and I ordered a bottle of Heskins and Rankin vintage bubbles because I had never drunk it before. And the waitress said, I dream about this wine. It's so good. And it was that good that ever since I've been dreaming about it. And you've, thanks very much to the Rankins and the Heskins.
Look, that is fantastic. Well, I hope you guys enjoy that. Thank you all for joining us here this evening. We're really delighted that you could make it. We look forward to seeing you again for next year's Henry Baldwin Lecture. And may God bless you and keep you in his love and care through Jesus Christ, our Lord. God bless you and good night. Thank you.